Welcome back to Where Would James Bond Be Without His Wristwatch? My name is Dell Deaton and I'm author-creator of the JamesBondWatches.com website and blog. Following is part 4 of 6 of my presentation on James Bond watches to the 64th Annual Convention of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors, held in Grand Rapids, Michigan, June 13, 2009. As I said in part 1, I've given this presentation a PG rating. This relates to a James Bond watch joke that I will be telling in a few minutes. Picking up where I left off in part 3, we're talking about the pinball effect, serendipity, things that you wouldn't learn if you weren't talking about James Bond watch, trivia items, fun items. One of the things that I've carved up is the Eon Productions films, looked at watch gadgets per Bond actor. You can then draw whatever conclusions you want in terms of whether more gadgets, diversity of gadgets, makes a James Bond a better James Bond, makes a James Bond film a better James Bond film, or the opposite. Daniel Craig, Timothy Dalton, and George Lazenby are all tied at 0. Sean Connery shows here with 1 for the one gadget watch that he wore in a Eon Productions film in Thunderball. This does not, of course, include the gadget watch that he wore in Never Say Never Again. Pierce Brosnan and Roger Moore are tied at the same number of gadgets. Mr. Brosnan repeated gadgets. Mr. Moore had a greater variety of gadgets. And then again, on the right side of this presentation here, you can see perhaps as many as a dozen different kinds of watch gadgets that have been featured, which repeats of an earlier slide I showed. Okay, the James Bond wristwatch joke. James Bond walks into a bar. An attractive woman is seated there, and he sits down next to her and introduces himself with the famous line. She's then skeptical and says, "Well, if you are indeed James Bond as you say, is there any way in which you can prove to me that you are James Bond?" He says, "Well, I happen to be wearing a gadget watch, a watch provided to me by none other than Q." "What does it do?" she says. "Well, it tells me something about the person, the target, that is not readily apparent, or perhaps even something that they would not want me to know." "What's it say about me?" she asks. Waves the watch in front of her, turns, pushes, does some various manipulations of the case, pulls the watch back, looks at it, and his eyebrows raise. "What does it say?" she says. He says, "Well, you're not wearing any underwear." "Why, never," she said, taken aback, indignant, almost angry. James Bond looks at his watch, taps on the crystal, and says, "Darn thing's running 2 hours fast again." Where was my introduction to James Bond? I'm not quite old enough to have been around when the original, very first books were written in the 1950s. So I was more of a student of the books in their reprints, and then of course the movies as they were hitting the theaters, and then later as they came to be on television. My introduction to James Bond, probably as most significantly as a boy, I recall the Corgi version of the Aston Martin DB5 with functioning gadgets, which I got one Christmas in the mid-1960s. So again, as I talk very favorably about licensed products, this is another one of those that's made good, and the car in this picture is in fact that same car that I was given all those years ago. As I grew older, my understanding of the Bond films increased, of course. I knew more things. I could talk about the history, why it is that The Spy Who Loved Me, which is the next landmark that we're going to talk about, was significant in terms of the producer, the change from the Dan-Jack Eon production partnerships between Broccoli and Saltzman, Roger Moore coming into his own as 007, the blockbuster caliber of that film in the mid-1970s. But to be honest with you, probably the most important, or equally important to thing me personally, was the Bond girl and the discovery of Bond girls in general. In this case, Barbara Bach as Agent XXX in The Spy Who Loved Me. Notwithstanding, my first Grail watch was in fact what we at James Bond Watches called the Atlantis Seiko for identification and research purposes. As my interest matured, of course, there was an evolution in Bond girls. There was also the Seiko 0674 Quartz LC, which in my case does not have the gadgets and therefore does not have the means of interrupting anything that I may be doing otherwise. The other thing that I find particularly nice about The Spy Who Loved Me and the Seiko partnership, which I so admire, is the idea that from a marketing standpoint it represented a real partnership. An early partnership between James Bond and the consumer products. There are, for example, not just collecting watches that we have available to us now, but collecting watches as they are featured in James Bond posters. Now, of course, you want to remember as you're looking at these pick-and-place websites that are out there without a lot of original research or understanding of horology and or James Bond films, that the watches that are featured in those posters were not actually featured in the films. So, again, your research talents can be torqued in this regard. Next item, of course, next grail watch for me, I suppose, was the Omega Seamaster 253180. This was worn by Pierce Brosnan. This model was worn by Pierce Brosnan in his last 3 outings as James Bond. What is nice about this, I've talked earlier about the idea of culture and technology and history as it relates to James Bond watches. There's also a personal element to it, not just for me, but for you all as you collect. In this case, this watch is associated with Tomorrow Never Dies, and that film was first run when my son was born, and therefore I always associate the two. Much as I had always envisioned myself to be a researcher, and that was the original goal of James Bond watches, there are new films that come out. As Casino Royale was coming out and we ended up with a new James Bond, I formed relationships with websites such as Dedicated to Daniel, sought out these people who had existing fan networks as it related to Daniel Craig long before the James Bond fans ever found them. Much to their discredit, many of the Bond sites disregarded these people as a valuable resource with valuable information, and so I was able to access high-resolution images that no one else could get a hold of, showed them a direct outreach, and they provided me with images, and I provided them with information, and as a result I became the first person that I know of, and I think generally recognized as such, to identify the new James Bond watch in Casino Royale in 2006. Subsequently, there was a special edition of that watch. The watch in the previous frame was the Omega Seamaster 2900 5091 Seamaster Planet Ocean. There was a special limited edition, very limited edition, of 5,007 copies of the watch here. It had the counterbalance had the 007 logo, and it had some special other treatments. In this particular image of my watch, I reflected a 1/18 scale Aston Martin into the anti-reflective coating on this watch. And I became, again, by serendipity, I suppose, the first person to actually say and make people aware of the idea that there was a very, very limited edition watch coming out. Previously, there had been the 40th anniversary edition of the Seamaster in 2002, limited to 10,007 pieces. There was a blue Seamaster related to Casino Royale, which was also 10,007 pieces. So there was a lot of skepticism when I said, keep your eyes out for this really big one coming up. This is also the watch that we are using for the Bond watches, James Bond watches exhibit at the National Watch and Clock Museum. Display that's going to be opening June 17th, 2010. I've been serving for the last year or so as the guest curator and will continue through the close of the show.